I never thought I'd be standing on a desolate African beach, staring at a woman buried up to her neck in sand, begging for death. But that's exactly where this story ends. And if you think that's the worst part, you have no idea what these 600 souls endured to get there. What I'm about to tell you happened in 1552, and it's one of the most disturbing maritime disasters you've never heard of. A disaster that wasn't just about a shipwreck. It was about what came after. The walking, the dying, the betrayal, and the choice one woman made that still haunts me to this day. Let me take you back to February 3rd, 1552, in the port city of Cochin on India's western coast. The air smelled of cinnamon, pepper, and salt water. The docks were alive with the sounds of merchants haggling, ropes creaking, and the distant calls of sailors preparing for the journey of their lives. Among them was Captain Manuel de Sousa Sepúlveda, a Portuguese military hero, a man who'd earned his reputation through blood and cunning in the spice wars that ravaged the Indian Ocean. Manuel wasn't just any captain. He was revered, almost worshipped by his men. He came from a good family, fought in brutal campaigns, and now commanded the spice trade route between Joe and Portugal itself. This was a man who had everything to lose. Standing beside him on the dock was his wife, Leonor. Beautiful, intelligent, strong-willed. She wasn't supposed to be there. Most captains didn't bring their families on these treacherous voyages, but Manuel insisted. He wanted her close. Their children, too. Looking back now, knowing what I know, I can't help but wonder if some part of him sensed what was coming. If this has happened to you, if you've ever had that gut feeling that something terrible is about to unfold, sensed it, in the comments. The ship they were about to board was called the São João, St. John in English, and it was a beast. One of the largest galleons in the Portuguese fleet, a massive multi-deck vessel that had been converted midway through construction from a warship into a cargo hauler. And on that February morning, it was loaded to the brim. Over 1,300 tons of pepper, along with exotic woods, medicines, spices that Europeans would kill for, quite literally. But here's the thing, and this is where the first crack in the foundation appears. The ship was also carrying 600 people. 600! Crew, passengers, and others who were there against their will. Captives. Slaves. Human cargo alongside the spices. Even before they left port, some of the crew voiced concerns. The ship was too heavy, they said. The weight made it dangerous in storms, a target for pirates, unstable in rough seas. But Manuel wouldn't hear it. He was on a schedule, under orders, and the São João departed Cochin exactly on time, sailing southwest toward Africa. And for the first 2 months, everything seemed fine. The winds were favorable, the seas relatively calm, and the crew settled into the rhythm of life at sea. But then April 13th arrived, and with it, the coast of Africa came into view for the first time. That should have been a moment of relief. They were making progress. They'd see Portugal soon. But the ship was already behind schedule. The storms they'd encountered on the way had torn the sails to shreds in places, leaving them with tatters flapping uselessly in the wind. And worse, these were the only sails they had. There were no replacements. So they pushed forward, limping along the natal coast, just southwest of Madagascar, hoping the favorable winds would hold. They didn't. Suddenly, without warning, the winds shifted. Headwinds, powerful and relentless, blowing northeast when they needed to go southwest. The ship became almost impossible to control, and Manuel faced a choice. Push through and risk everything, turn back to Cochin and lose an entire season waiting for better weather, or turn the ship so the headwinds became tailwinds and hope for the best. He chose the third option, and that's when the ocean decided to show them who was really in control. A new storm was brewing, more violent than anything they'd faced before, and there was no outrunning it. The ship was suddenly battered by winds from both east and west, waves crashing over the deck, water flooding the lower levels faster than they could bail it out. Thunder cracked overhead, lightning illuminated the terror on every face, and the São João, this massive beast of a ship, was being tossed around like a child's toy. Manuel ordered the crew to start throwing cargo overboard. Barrels of pepper, crates of spices, anything to lighten the load. But it made no difference. The ship was too heavy, too unstable, built wrong for this kind of weather. See, while the French, English, and Dutch were designing ships with lower centers of gravity, longer keels, better stability, the Portuguese were obsessed with cargo capacity. The São João was longer, narrower, top-heavy with guns and goods. And now, in the middle of a violent storm, those design flaws became death sentences. For the next 27 days, the ship and everyone aboard were tormented by successive storms. 27 days. Imagine that. Nearly a month of constant terror, waves smashing against the hull, the ship groaning and creaking like it was screaming in pain. Between storms, when the crew could finally assess the damage, the news was devastating. The mast was destroyed, the topsail, the mainsail gone, and worst of all, the rudder was beyond repair. The ship's carpenter discovered that 3 of the pintles, the hinges that allow the rudder to steer, were completely gone. When Manuel heard this, he ordered the carpenter to keep it secret. He knew that if word got out, morale would collapse entirely. But the damage was obvious to anyone with eyes. The ship was dying, and everyone knew it. The crew tried desperately to fix what they could between storms. They sewed sails, fashioned a new mast from the broken remains of the old one, even attempted to build a makeshift rudder. But as soon as the next storm rolled in, all their efforts were obliterated by the ocean. But that wasn't even the strangest part. By June 8th, the ship had gone almost nowhere since April. 2 months of drifting, struggling, barely surviving. But they did manage to get close enough to see the natal coast again. And that's when Manuel made a decision that would seal their fate. He ordered the ship to drift with the current until they reached shallow water, about 60 feet deep. Then he sent a lifeboat ahead to scout the coastline for a good place to beach the ship. The crew rowed along jagged rocks, massive boulders that would smash the São João to pieces, until finally they found one clearing north of what's now Port Edward. When they returned, Manuel and the ship's pilot guided the vessel toward that spot, dropped anchor in about 42 feet of water, and began the evacuation process. And here's where things get strange. Maritime custom dictates that the captain is the last to leave a sinking ship. But the very first people off the São João were Manuel, his wife Leonor, their children, and 20 crewmen assigned to guard them on land. Once they were settled on shore, the lifeboat returned for more passengers. It made several successful trips over the next 3 days, ferrying people from ship to shore. But it was slow, agonizingly slow, and on the 3rd day, disaster struck. The pilot, still aboard the ship, noticed that the landline, the rope connecting the ship to shore, had been severed, probably cut against the sharp coastal rocks. And without that line, the anchor couldn't hold the ship in place. The pilot and 40 other crew immediately jumped into a lifeboat and made a desperate run for shore, smashing against a boulder but making it to land alive. For the 500 people still aboard the São João, there would be no such luck. Moments after the landline broke, the ship, unable to hold its position in the turbulent waters, smashed against the rocks and split almost perfectly in half. People were thrown into the water, clinging to wreckage, screaming, drowning. Then, less than an hour later, the ship broke into 4 pieces, sending everyone remaining into the sea along with all the cargo. More than 100 people lost their lives in that wreck. Crew, passengers, captives, their bodies washing up on shore for days. But more than 400 managed to swim, crawl, cling to debris and make it to land, joining the 100 survivors who'd been ferried there earlier. In the immediate aftermath, there was just silence. Shock. These people had survived a disabled ship in horrific weather for almost 2 months, and now they were marooned on a desolate African coast with almost nothing. No food, barely any water, surrounded by an unknown land that could be hostile. Manuel tried to salvage what he could from the wreckage, initially believing they could build a new boat, a smaller caravel, from the remains. But 4 hours after the wreck, there wasn't a single piece of wood on shore bigger than an arm's length. Building a ship was impossible. So Manuel did what he could. He organized the survivors, built shelters using barrels and chests from the wreck, and for the next 12 days, they survived on a small amount of flour and kept warm by large fires. They found a freshwater source, thank God, but staying on that beach wasn't an option. It was early July by then, and the number of ships passing by during the African winter would be almost zero. They couldn't wait for rescue. They had to walk. During those 12 days, they didn't see a single local person. Not one. Until one afternoon, some crewmen spotted a small group on a hill, leading a cow. The Portuguese used hand signals to call them down, and after some hesitation, the locals approached. Through gestures, they communicated that they were interested in iron and would trade the cow for some. Manuel returned with 2 handfuls of iron nails from the wreckage, and the locals seemed pleased. The deal was almost done. But then more people appeared on the hill, shouting in their native language, and suddenly the locals with the cow changed their minds. No trade. They left, and with them went any hope of an easy meal. On the 12th day, Manuel called a council. After much debate, they decided their only option was to walk to Sofala, a Portuguese settlement on the Santo Espiritu River in what's now Mozambique. About 800 miles, on foot, through unknown territory, with almost no food or water. Before they left, Manuel stood before the entire group of 500 survivors to give a speech. Everyone expected inspiration, encouragement, a rallying cry. But instead, Manuel begged them never to forsake him or leave him behind. He literally instructed the able-bodied men to carry him if he couldn't walk any more. It was strange, selfish, and about all the captain had to offer before they embarked on what would become a death march. On July 7th, the journey began. In the beginning, they made decent progress, about 12 miles a day. Within the first month, they'd traveled more than 365 miles. But that was about the only thing going well. All they had to eat was a tiny ration of rice each day, and drinking water was scarce. Hunger and dehydration ravaged them, and those who became too weak were simply left behind. Among the first abandoned was a captive woman and her child, a boy who was supposedly Manuel's illegitimate son. When word reached Manuel days later, he was devastated. He offered money to anyone who'd go back and find them, but no one accepted. They knew it would be a death mission. Manuel tried again when thirst became unbearable, offering gold pieces to anyone who'd search for water. Again, no one took the offer. Before long, they started encountering local tribes. Some were friendly. Most were not. Rarely did a day go by without an attack, and many died fighting them off. But incredibly, despite the hunger, thirst, and constant violence, they made it to the Santo Espiritu River 4 months after leaving the coast. They just had to follow it to Sofala now. They were so close. Along the way, they met a local king of a friendly tribe who welcomed them into his community. Remarkably, this wasn't the first time the tribe had encountered shipwrecked Portuguese survivors, so the king and many others had learned some Portuguese. They could actually communicate. The king explained that his tribe was at war with a hostile neighboring tribe, and it wasn't safe for the group to continue. For almost 2 weeks, the survivors stayed, sheltered, fed, and protected. But Manuel's brother-in-law, after joining the king's warriors in a campaign against the hostile tribe, returned and advised they should leave and continue to Sofala. When the king learned of this, he urged Manuel not to go. He knew that if they encountered the neighboring tribe, things would end badly. But Manuel, convinced by his brother-in-law, refused to listen. The king then suggested at least taking a detour around the war zone, which would add distance but keep them safe. Again, Manuel refused. He wanted to reach Sofala as quickly as possible, and so, ignoring the king's warnings, the group pressed on. Sure enough, they soon encountered a group of about 200 armed men from the hostile tribe. But strangely, they seemed friendly. They even led Manuel to meet their king, who eagerly offered to build shelters, provide food, and personally guide them through his territory to the river. But there was one condition. If Manuel wanted this help, the entire group would have to hand over their muskets and swords. The king claimed the weapons frightened his people. Leonor, Manuel's wife, immediately advised against it. She knew disarming in the presence of unknown people was suicide. But just like before, Manuel didn't listen. One by one, the survivors dropped their weapons at the king's feet, and when the last musket was collected, the king ordered his warriors to attack. Anyone who fought back was killed. Those who surrendered were split into smaller groups and scattered across various villages. And Leonor, beautiful, strong-willed Leonor, was viciously assaulted and stripped of her clothing. Humiliated beyond measure, she couldn't bear the thought of her servants seeing her naked. So she dug a hole in the sand and buried herself up to her neck, refusing to leave under any circumstances. And true to her word, she stayed in that hole until she starved to death. With his wife dead and one of his children abandoned long before, Manuel's sanity finally snapped. He wandered aimlessly around the village for a few days, muttering to himself, and then walked into the African wilderness, never to be seen again. The remaining survivors were held captive, forced to endure more hardships, more abuse, more death. By early 1553, word reached Portuguese ships that the São João never arrived home, and a search party was commissioned. It took time, but they eventually found the hostile tribe and the remaining survivors. The leader negotiated with the king, agreeing to pay 1 Spanish silver dollar for each survivor's freedom. Sadly, they brought far more money than they needed. Of the original 500 people who began the march, only about 25 were still alive. 25. The freed survivors were guided the rest of the way to Sofala, finally reaching safety on May 25, 1553, more than a year after the São João first encountered trouble. It's believed that the wreck of the São João resulted in one of the first recorded encounters between Europeans and South Africans, a dark milestone in human history. 600 souls boarded that ship in Cochin. 25 made it to Sofala. The rest died in storms, drowned in shipwrecks, starved on beaches, were abandoned on death marches, killed by hostile tribes, or buried themselves alive in the sand to escape the horror of what their lives had become. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments what part of this story affected you most. Was it Leonor's choice? Manuel's cowardice? The sheer brutality of survival? Drop your thoughts below, and if you want more stories like this, stories that history tried to forget, hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, this is just the beginning.